The note was still in her hand when Florence Whitfield heard the sound of a horse moving fast through the dark beyond her property line. She stood barefoot on the cold wooden porch, the pre-dawn air biting at her ankles, her knuckles white around a folded square of paper that smelled faintly of leather and something else she could not name. The gate at the end of her path swung on its new hinge, with a quiet, confident ease it had never had in the 2 years she had lived alone on this stretch of New Mexico Territory land. The gate she had never been able to afford to fix. The gate her late husband Randall had promised to fix 17 times and never had. The gate that had been hanging crooked and broken since the winter storm of 1882, dragging in the dirt and letting coyotes wander too close to her chickens. Someone had fixed it in the night. The note read, in a rough but deliberate hand, "A woman alone needs a latch." Her heart hammered with something she had no honest name for. It was not entirely fear, though fear was present. It was not entirely gratitude, though that was there too. It was something older and more dangerous than either of those things. Something she had trained herself not to feel since the morning she had buried Randall Whitfield, and understood clearly that she was utterly, completely on her own. She pressed the note against her chest and stared down the road where the hoofbeats were fading into nothing. The year was 1883. She was 29 years old. She had $7.40 in a tin box under the floorboard in her kitchen, a small herd of 6 cattle that she managed alone, 30 acres of dry New Mexico scrubland on the outskirts of a town called Raven Bluff, and absolutely no idea who had come to her gate in the darkness and done her an act of quiet, unexplained kindness. But she had seen the horse once before. It had been 2 weeks earlier when the stranger had stopped at the end of her road. She had been hauling water from the well, the wooden bucket hanging heavy in both her fists, sweat already soaking through her dress though it was barely 7 in the morning. She had looked up and seen a man on a dark bay horse at the edge of her property, watching her. Not in a predatory way. Not in the way the men from town sometimes watched her, with that particular mix of pity and calculation that made her stomach turn. He had been watching her the way a person watches something that troubles them in a quiet, unresolved way. She had straightened up, set down the bucket, and looked directly back at him. He had touched the brim of his hat, a simple, courteous gesture. Then he had ridden on without saying a word, and she had picked up her bucket and told herself she was too busy and too tired to be curious about strangers. She had been lying to herself. Florence went back inside as the first pale light began to color the horizon. She set the note down on the kitchen table next to her coffee tin and stood looking at it while the stove warmed and the coffee began to smell like something almost hopeful. She read it again. A woman alone needs a latch. Not threatening. Not presumptuous. Not signed with a name or a claim. Just a fact stated plainly by someone who had chosen to do something about it in the dark before anyone was awake to see. She thought about that deliberate anonymity for a long time. In Raven Bluff, New Mexico Territory, in the year 1883, a woman alone on 30 acres was not a thing people noticed in a generous way. She was a thing people noticed with speculation. The widows and the bachelors and the ranchers who wanted her land, and the women at the church who sent her looks that could either be sympathy or judgment depending on the angle. Florence had learned to keep her chin up and her needs invisible. She did not ask for help. She had learned in the years of her marriage, and the months since that asking for help was just another way of making yourself small in someone else's eyes. Whoever had fixed her gate had understood that. They had not asked. They had not knocked on her door at a reasonable hour with a charitable expression and waited for her gratitude. They had come in the dark and left before she could thank them or be embarrassed or feel the particular weight of a favor she could not return. She folded the note and put it in the pocket of her apron. She spent the morning feeding the cattle, mending a stretch of fence along the eastern pasture, and keeping her mind deliberately blank on the subject of strangers on dark bay horses. It was a discipline she was good at. The frontier did not reward excessive sentiment, and Florence had become very good at converting feeling into labor. By afternoon, she was in Raven Bluff for her weekly supply trip, her wagon steady on the dry road, dust rising in pale columns behind the wheels. The town was the size of a decent ambition, which was to say it was larger than a whisper and smaller than a promise. A main street with a mercantile, a bank, the sheriff's office with its warped sign, a saloon that did reasonable business, a small church, a livery stable, a doctor's office, and a scattering of houses behind these establishments. Population somewhere near 400, though it swelled when the cattle drives came through. She tied her horse outside the mercantile and went in for flour, coffee, salt, and a small length of cotton cloth she needed to mend a shirt. Carl Hobbs, who ran the store with his wife, was talking to someone across the counter when Florence came in, and she moved to the shelves without paying attention to the conversation, because she never paid attention to conversations that weren't hers. "The Bailey name," Carl was saying in a careful, lowered voice, "is not something folks around here are real comfortable hearing, even if he's trying to be done with all that." Florence picked up a sack of flour and did not look toward the counter. "He bought that parcel out on the eastern ridge," Carl's wife Meredith said from somewhere near the bolts of fabric. "Cash money. No questions answered about where it came from. That's the kind of thing that makes people nervous." "I don't know that he's done anything wrong in this county," a third voice said, and it was this voice that made Florence go still. It was a voice that matched the quality of the note. Deep and measured and containing the particular cadence of a man who had learned to weigh his words before spending them. She turned her head just slightly. He was standing at the counter with his back half turned to the room, a tall man with broad shoulders and dark hair that needed cutting by about 3 weeks, wearing a coat that had seen serious weather and serious roads. His hat was on the counter beside him while he looked at the list Carl was reading from. He was, she estimated, somewhere around 32 or 33, with the kind of face that had been made interesting rather than handsome by the specific difficulties of whatever life he had led. A scar along his jaw, hands that were scarred at the knuckles but moved with careful precision on the counter. He was buying nails, a good quantity of them, and lumber fittings. "Grant Bailey," Meredith said quietly from beside Florence, who had not realized the woman had drifted close, "came into the territory about a month ago. Nobody knows the full story, but there are enough pieces of it floating around that people have formed opinions." Florence looked at her. "Should I have an opinion?" Meredith tilted her head and said nothing more. Florence bought her supplies and left without looking at Grant Bailey again, though she was aware of his position in the room the entire time she was in it, the way you are aware of a fire when you have been cold for a long time. She drove home in the afternoon light and thought about the name. Bailey. She had heard it, she realized, before she came to Raven Bluff. In the news that traveled through territory towns the way all news traveled, by tongue and rumor, and the exaggeration that distance always adds. The Bailey Gang, they had called them, operating out of the Texas Panhandle through the early 1880s. A band of 5 or 6 men known for robbing stagecoach routes and a particular Wells Fargo shipment in 1881 that had made enough noise to reach the territorial newspapers. Not violent men as those things went. There had been no killings attributed to them, but there had been a betrayal somewhere in the story, she thought. Someone had turned someone else in. The gang had scattered. She could not remember the details clearly enough to be certain of anything. She did not know if Grant Bailey was that Bailey. She did not know why it mattered. Back at the farmhouse, she stopped the wagon at her gate and stepped down to open it. It swung wide and clean on the new hinge, and the latch caught solidly when she pushed it shut behind her. She stood with her hand on the warm iron of the latch for a moment. It was a good piece of work, solid and competent and done without waste or show. That was the thing that undid her a little, not the gesture but the quality of it, the care in it. She went inside and made supper and sat alone at her table the way she did every evening, and told herself that whatever she was feeling was nothing more than the ordinary loneliness of a widow in her 3rd year of solitude. that it had nothing to do with a stranger's hands working carefully in the dark before dawn, and that she was far too practical a woman to let a fixed gate and a 5-word note mean anything at all. She was still telling herself this 3 days later when Grant Bailey appeared at the end of her road again. She was in the yard this time, splitting wood, when she heard the horse and looked up. He stopped at the gate and did not open it, which she noted. He sat on the dark bay horse and waited, and there was nothing aggressive or presumptuous in his posture. He was simply waiting to be acknowledged, the way a person waits when they know they are on someone else's ground. Florence buried the axe in the splitting block and walked to the gate. She looked at him from her side of it. He looked at her from his. "You fixed my gate," she said. He nodded once. "It needed fixing." "I didn't ask you to." "No," he agreed. "You didn't." She studied him. He did not look away, but he also did not press forward. The bay horse shifted beneath him, and he steadied it with a small movement of his knee, easy and automatic. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment that was not uncomfortable exactly, but was honest in a way that a quick answer would not have been. "I was passing by a few weeks back," he said. "Saw you hauling water and I saw the gate. Both things struck me as needing attention." "I've been hauling water for 2 years," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not the part I could fix." She had not expected that answer, and she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum with a quiet, stubborn weight. "Grant Bailey," she said, putting the name out in the space between them. He did not flinch. "Florence Whitfield," he said, and she understood that he had learned her name the same way she had been learning his. "People in town have opinions about you," she said. "Yes," he said, "they do. You're not going to tell me they're wrong." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to tell you they're entirely wrong," he said. "I think you're a woman who prefers the truth to the comfortable answer." She was. She had preferred the truth her entire life, and it had been a preference that had not always served her well, but she had never been able to give it up. "What do you want, Mr. Bailey?" she asked. "Nothing from you," he said, and he meant it. She could tell because he did not dress it up. "I bought that ridge parcel to the east. I'm rebuilding the structure up there. I'll be your neighbor." "I thought it was better to introduce myself honestly than to let you hear about me only from other people." She considered that for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass along the road. A hawk circled high and indifferent above them. "There's coffee on the stove," she said. "If you want to introduce yourself properly, you can come through the gate and do it like a civilized person." Something moved briefly across his face that was almost a smile, but was held back by some private discipline. He dismounted, tied the horse to the post, and opened the gate. He latched it carefully behind him without being asked to. Florence turned and walked toward the house, and he followed her at a respectful distance, and the morning continued around them with the ordinary sounds of the territory, wind and hawks, and the distant bellow of one of her cattle somewhere in the pasture. He sat at her kitchen table while she poured 2 cups of coffee, and she sat across from him, and they regarded each other with the frank, measuring quality of 2 people who have each learned that hasty judgments are expensive. "What's the truth, then?" she asked. "About the parts that people in town aren't wrong about." He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked down at it for a moment. "I rode with men who took things that weren't theirs to take," he said. "For about 3 years. I told myself reasons that seemed adequate at the time. They don't seem as adequate now." "Did you hurt anyone?" "Not directly," he said. "But I was part of something that frightened people and disrupted their lives, and I've spent enough time thinking about it to know that I don't get to excuse myself just because I wasn't the one pointing the gun at specific moments." Florence absorbed this. She respected it more than a denial would have earned, though it also opened every question a denial would have closed. "What changed?" she asked. He looked up from the coffee cup, and there was something in his eyes that was old and complicated. "The man I thought was my closest friend in that life," he said slowly, "turned me into a federal marshal for the reward money. Told me he was doing it because he wanted to go straight, but he took the money, so the sincerity of his conscience was debatable." "That's betrayal," Florence said. "Yes," he said simply. "That's the correct word for it." "What happened after?" "The marshal who arrested me was a man named Harker. He had some discretion about how to handle the case. He was also a man who had come up hard and made his own reckonings with himself, and I think he saw something in me he recognized. He gave me a choice: 3 years at Yuma or 5 years of service as an informant on other operations while appearing to be free. I chose the second because I thought I could do more good that way than I could sitting in a cell. It also nearly got me killed twice, which was perhaps part of the justice in it. Florence held her coffee cup and looked at him. He was not performing this story. He was not arranging it for her sympathy. He was telling it the way a person tells something they have told themselves so many times they have long since stripped the drama from it and are left with just the shape of what happened. "And now," she asked. "And now my service is done," he said. "I have money I saved, I have land I bought legally, and I am attempting to become someone whose daily decisions I can justify. It is a slow process." "Is there anyone looking for you?" she asked, because she was practical and she needed to know. "There are men from my former life who would prefer I wasn't easily found," he said. "But I've been in Raven Bluff for a month and no one has come. I think most of those men have other concerns." "Most," she noted. "I won't lie to you about the word most," he said. She set down her coffee cup and looked at the window, at the yard beyond it, at the gate in the distance that swung clean and straight in the morning light. "All right, Mr. Bailey," she said. "You've introduced yourself. I'm Florence Whitfield. I'm a widow. I've been working this land alone since my husband died 2 years ago. I have 6 cattle, 30 acres, and a temper that I manage reasonably well most of the time. I don't need looking after, and I don't need pity, and I don't need anyone making decisions about my property without asking. But I also know that a neighbor who tells you the truth when he doesn't have to is a rarer thing than people pretend, and I value rare things." He looked at her for a moment with that almost smile held carefully in check. "I'll remember that," he said. "See that you do," she said. He finished his coffee, thanked her for it with a quiet sincerity that was more impressive than elaborate courtesy would have been, and took his horse and left. She watched him go from the porch, and then went back to her wood splitting, and told herself that this was simply a neighbor situation, and that she was handling it sensibly. The weeks that followed were a study in the particular torture of 2 careful people in proximity. Grant Bailey worked hard on the Ridge parcel. She could see the smoke from the construction fire on clear mornings, and she knew from Carl Hobbs, who knew everything about everyone's supply needs, that Bailey was building a proper structure, not a rough shelter. He came into town twice a week, did his business quietly, was polite to everyone, bought his fair share and nothing more, and generated the kind of low-level anxious gossip that a known quantity generates more slowly than an unknown one. He came by her road twice in those weeks, and both times he stopped at the gate and waited, and both times she walked out to meet him, and they talked with the gate between them in a way that was becoming its own particular ritual. He told her about the progress of his building. She told him about a problem she was having with a section of the eastern fence where something had been testing it. He told her she should double the strands of wire there, and she told him she already knew that. She simply did not have the wire yet. He offered to bring some from town on his next supply run, and she considered whether accepting this was practical or something else, and decided it was practical, which was true, and was also something else, which she decided not to examine. He brought the wire. He left it at the gate post with a length of it already cut to the right size, which meant he had looked at the fence section at some point to estimate it, which meant he had been paying quiet attention to the details of her land, and she found this simultaneously irritating and something she had no clean name for. She spent a long afternoon stringing the new wire along the fence line, and while she worked, she allowed herself to think about what was actually happening in the small, careful space that was forming between her and Grant Bailey. She was not a woman who ignored things just because they were inconvenient. She had married Randall Whitfield at 22 because she had been certain enough of him and of herself, and of their shared capacity for building something. She had loved Randall in a solid, companionable way that had seemed like enough until it wasn't, and when he died, she had grieved him with an honesty that included grieving the things their life together had not been as much as the things it had. She was not a woman who needed another person to complete her. She had completed herself, albeit through 2 years of relentless work and stubborn self-sufficiency. But she was also not a woman who was going to pretend. She wasn't drawn toward Grant Bailey in a way that was distinct and serious and increasingly difficult to manage with her habitual practicality. She finished stringing the fence and stood back and checked it and found it solid, and she thought, all right then, recognize it and decide what to do with it sensibly. The problem was that what she wanted to do with it was not entirely sensible. Autumn came down on the territory with its particular sharp beauty, the cottonwoods along the creek line going gold and then bronze and then bare, the mornings getting a quality of cold that required a coat before breakfast. Florence's cattle were doing well enough. She sold 2 in October for a price she had negotiated herself at the livestock auction in Raven Bluff, standing her ground in the corral yard, while 3 different men tried to talk the price down, until she looked the last one in the eye and said she would load them back on the wagon if he said another number below what she'd named, and he had paid her price. She rode home with the money and felt something she recognized as satisfaction, which was as close as she generally let herself get to pride. She stopped at the base of the ridge on her way home and looked up at what Grant Bailey had built. It was a proper house. Small but well constructed, with a porch that faced east toward the morning and a chimney that was already trailing smoke into the cold sky. The kind of structure a man builds when he intends to stay. She sat in her wagon and looked at it for longer than was reasonable, and then she drove on. He came to the gate 2 days later and she went out and they stood in the cooling afternoon and she said without preamble, I saw your house. It's well built. He looked at her. Would you like to see it properly? She thought about it with the clarity she tried to apply to most things. Yes, she said, I would. She went on Sunday afternoon, riding her horse up the ridge road that wound through scrub oak and juniper. He met her at the top and took her horse's bridle while she dismounted, and she was aware of his proximity in a way that was no longer something she was trying not to be aware of. The house was 2 rooms on the ground floor with a sleeping loft above, solidly framed, with windows that had actual glass in them because, she learned, he had ordered the glass from a glazier in Santa Fe and waited 3 weeks for it. He had a stove that was better than hers, a long work table, a bookshelf with a surprising number of books for a man with his history, and a set of wooden chairs around a small table that had the look of recent and careful work. You made these, she said, touching the back of one of the chairs. I had time in the evenings, he said. It was not modest, it was just the truth. She ran her fingers along the smooth curve of the wood and thought about hands that had spent years doing rough and questionable things, and had come through all of that and learned to make chairs. Sit down, he said. I'll put coffee on. She sat down at his table and looked around the small, clean house while he worked at the stove, and it felt more comfortable than it had any right to, being in a stranger's house, except that he was becoming less of a stranger in increments she was tracking with the careful attention she gave to most things. They talked for 2 hours. Not about the past, not about the gate or the wire or the careful negotiations of the previous weeks, but about things of substance. The politics of the territory, the question of statehood that was always being discussed and never being settled, the nature of the cattle market and its relationship to the rail lines that were creeping steadily westward. He had read widely and thought about what he had read, and she had done the same, and they discovered a particular pleasure in arguing with each other in the specific way that 2 intelligent people argue when they are both willing to be wrong about things. She rode home in the golden late afternoon, and the horse knew the way, and she let it go at a walk while she sat in the saddle and felt, with a kind of solemn recognition, that she was in real trouble, because she was not simply drawn to him anymore. She was beginning to trust him, and trust, for Florence Whitfield, was a far more dangerous thing than attraction. November arrived with the first hard frost and a windstorm that came out of the north like a personal grievance and tore 3 shingles off the south side of Florence's roof. She discovered this in the early morning when the cold poured through the damaged section, and she woke to the sound of dripping. She climbed up onto the roof herself with a hammer and some salvaged shingles from the barn, and patched it as best she could while the cold made her hands clumsy, and the wind pulled at her balance on the pitched surface. She was coming down the ladder when she heard the horse on the road below. Grant Bailey pulled up and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is controlling a strong instinct in favor of propriety. "Were you just on your roof?" he said. "I was," she said, setting the hammer down on the porch step. "The wind did some damage. 3 shingles on the south face. I've patched it for now. It'll need proper work in the spring." He sat on the horse and looked at the roof line, and she could see him thinking, and she said before he could offer, "I managed it." "I can see that," he said, and there was nothing patronizing in it. It was simply acknowledgement. She looked up at him in the cold morning light, and something shifted in the arrangement of things between them, some final adjustment of the distance she had been maintaining. "Get down off that horse and come inside," she said. "I'll make breakfast." He came down off the horse. She made eggs and biscuits, and they sat across from each other at her kitchen table, and the domesticity of it was absurd and also entirely right. He ate with the appreciation of a man who had spent months cooking for himself, which she recognized because she had been doing the same. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and the cold morning pressed against the windows, and inside this small sphere of warmth she felt something she had not felt in so long it took her a moment to identify it. Safe. She felt safe. Not safe the way you are safe from external threat, but safe the way you are safe when the person across the table from you is exactly what they appear to be. No hidden motive she could detect in him. No agenda she could identify beyond the honest one he had stated at the beginning. He was trying to become someone whose choices he could stand behind. "Grant," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. He looked up from his plate. "I want to say something, and I want you to let me say all of it before you respond to any of it," she said. "All right," he said. "I'm not a sentimental woman," she said. "I have been careful in the months since I met you at that gate not to make things into something they weren't. I've told myself a number of times that I was simply being neighborly and practical, and that whatever I was feeling was loneliness or habit or the ordinary desire for company." She paused and straightened the edge of her plate with one finger. "None of those explanations are fully accurate, and I'm not willing to keep pretending otherwise, because pretending things are something other than what they are is a waste of effort that I can't afford." He had gone very still. "I like you," she said. "I like the way you think and the way you talk and the way you fixed my gate in the dark and left without making me thank you for it. I like that you told me the truth about yourself when the truth was not convenient. I like that you brought the right amount of wire and that you made chairs that are worth sitting in. I like that you argue with me about things and don't fold just because I'm certain." She stopped again and looked at him directly. "I'm telling you this because it is true, and because I have found that the time between knowing something true and saying it out loud is usually wasted time, and I have wasted enough of it already." The silence between them was the kind that has weight and texture. "Florence," he said, and the way he said her name had the quality of something long held and finally let go. "I have been very careful these months not to let you see how I felt because I knew my history was a problem, and I knew you were someone who deserved far more than a man with a complicated past offering her something she'd have to weigh too carefully. I didn't want you to feel like I was asking you to take on a burden. I'm not asking you if your past is clean," she said. "I'm asking if you are honest now. Those are different questions." "I am honest now," he said, "to the best of my ability and everything I have." "Then we're in agreement," she said. She held out her hand across the table and he took it, and his hand was warm and scarred and careful around hers, And they sat like that in the warm kitchen with the cold November morning outside, and everything rearranged itself into a new and better order. It was not an easy beginning. The things that were complicated did not become simple because two people had been honest with each other. The gossip in Raven Bluff intensified when people began to notice that Florence Whitfield and Grant Bailey were seen at the Mercantile together on supply days, and that his horse was often tied at her gate, and that she rode up to the ridge on Sunday afternoons with the regularity of a woman who had decided something. The reverend at the small church, a man named Coulter who was sincere if not always wise, stopped her after Sunday service in December and said gently that he hoped she was being careful about her reputation, that a widow spending time with a man of uncertain character could be misunderstood by the community. Florence looked at him with the particular patience she reserved for well-meaning interference. "Reverend Coulter," she said, "I manage 30 acres alone. I sell my own cattle. I set my own prices. I fix my own fence and my own roof, and I have done all of this without the community's assistance. I appreciate the concern, but I'll manage my reputation the same way I manage everything else." She walked to her wagon and drove home and was angrier than she wanted to be for about half the drive. And then she was just tired in the way that women of that time and place were tired in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. She told Gran about it that evening when he came by with a haunch of venison he had taken that morning, because he had learned that sharing what he had in excess was something she would accept more easily than an outright gift. "They're not wrong that your reputation matters," he said, cutting the venison at her counter while she started the stove. "In practical terms, this community is your livelihood." "I know," she said. "It still bothers me." "It should bother you," he said. "It's an injustice. You shouldn't have to manage anyone's opinion of you on top of everything else you manage." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Most men in your position would tell me the gossip isn't their fault." "It's not entirely my fault," he said, "but it's not my fault either." She shook her head and turned back to the stove, and he continued cutting the venison, and the kitchen filled with warm smells, and neither of them said anything for a few minutes. And these silences between them had become one of the best things about his presence. Silences she did not need to fill. He stayed for supper, and they talked about practical things, about the cattle and the spring calving she was planning, and the question of whether the eastern fence needed to be entirely rebuilt in the thaw or simply reinforced. He had opinions about her land that were useful without being presumptuous, and she had stopped minding that he paid attention to the details of it, because she understood now that his attention was not about ownership, but about genuine investment in her well-being. He left at a proper hour, and she stood on the porch in the cold watching his lantern move up the ridge road and thought about the Reverend's words and about reputation, and about the actual shape of what she wanted her life to look like. She wanted him in it, not in the polite neighboring way that was becoming genuinely insufficient. In the full, honest, permanent way that she had once tried with Randall, and that had been incomplete in ways she could only now clearly name because she had something to compare it to. She went inside and sat at the table and wrote a letter by lamplight, not to Grant but to her sister Clara in Albuquerque, who was the one person in the world to whom Florence said things she did not say aloud to anyone else. She wrote, "There is a man here. His name is Grant Bailey, and he has a complicated history that he has been honest with me about, and he fixed my broken gate in the dark before I knew who he was, and left me a note that said a woman alone needs a latch. And Clara, I am in love with him in the way that makes everything I felt before look like a warm friendship at best. I don't know what to do with it except to be as honest as I know how to be and trust that he is who he appears to be. I think he is. I think I know how to read people well enough by now." She sealed the letter and set it aside and went to bed and slept, for the first time in longer than she could calculate, without the specific weight of loneliness pressing on her chest like something that had forgotten to move. January came in with ice along the creek and temperatures that made every outside task a negotiation with the body's limitations. Florence kept the cattle alive and the stove burning and the roof intact, and managed the ordinary grinding work of winter on a small ranch with the competence she had built over 2 years of necessity. And Grant came every few days with venison or cut wood or occasionally just himself. And they sat at her table or sometimes at his table on the ridge, and the thing between them deepened with the quiet persistence of something that was rooted properly and intended to last. He kissed her for the first time in late January, standing on her porch in the cold after a long evening of arguing about the territorial land policy, a conversation that had moved from the kitchen table to the porch when they needed air, and he had said something she disagreed with, and she had turned to face him to say so, and found that they were much closer than the kitchen had trained her to expect, and the argument had simply stopped, replaced by something more urgent. It was a gentle kiss, brief and careful, asking more than claiming. She put her hand against his jaw where the scar was and kissed him back with an honesty that she thought probably told him everything he needed to know. He rested his forehead against hers in the cold dark and said nothing, and she did not need him to. He said it properly 2 weeks later, standing in her kitchen in the afternoon, which was characteristic of him. Not at a dramatic moment, but in an ordinary one, because he was a man who distrusted theater and meant what he said most clearly when he said it plainly. "I love you, Florence," he said. "I want to say it once clearly so that you know exactly where I stand and there is no uncertainty in either direction." She set down the coffee pot and looked at him. "I love you too," she said. "And I want us to stop negotiating with this careful inch-by-inch approach we've both been doing and decide what we actually want." He looked at her with the full weight of his attention. "What do you want?" "I want you to propose to me," she said, "so I can say yes and we can stop conducting our relationship like a real estate transaction." He was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, and then the controlled almost smile broke fully through into something real and warm that she had been waiting 3 months to see without restraint. "Florence Whitfield," he said, "will you marry me?" It was not quite a question. It had the shape of one but the certainty of a statement, and she appreciated the distinction enormously. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." They were married in March of 1884 by Reverend Coulter, who was a man of enough genuine goodness to set aside his earlier reservations and perform the ceremony with real warmth once he understood that Florence had made her decision with the full clarity for which she was known. Clara came from Albuquerque for the wedding and stood beside her sister in the small church and cried with unashamed sentiment, while Florence remained composed, except for the moment when Grant said his vows, at which point she became somewhat less composed, and Clara said later that it was the only time she had ever seen Florence look genuinely surprised by her own emotion. The wedding supper was held at the church hall because Raven Bluff was a community of people who could hold complexity. They were suspicious of Grant Bailey's past, and they also showed up with covered dishes and a fiddler named Pete Marsh who played until 11 o'clock, because they were also people who believed in the social contract of celebrating a proper marriage. Grant danced with her twice, which was once more than the occasion strictly required, and she danced with her hand in his and her head tilted up toward him, and thought that this was what it felt like when the right things finally arranged themselves correctly. Afterward, there was the ordinary beautiful strangeness of 2 solitary people becoming a household. They decided, after practical discussion, that they would live in Florence's house, while Grant rented his ridge property to a family that came in on the spring migration wave, which would bring in steady income while they expanded the cattle operation. Grant moved his books and his tools and the chairs he had made, and the house that had been too quiet for 2 years filled up with the comfortable noise of shared life. The spring of 1884 was one of the best seasons Florence could remember. The cattle calved well, 3 new animals, all strong, and she and Grant worked the calving together with the specific wordless efficiency of two people who have already learned to trust each other's competence. The eastern fence was rebuilt properly, and the south roof shingles were replaced with new ones. And Grant extended the porch on the west side because Florence had said once, only once, that she had always wanted to sit and watch the sunset without craning her neck, and he had remembered it. The porch was finished in April, and she came home from town one afternoon to find it complete, the new boards pale and clean in the warm light, two chairs side by side facing west. She stood looking at it for a long moment. "It's level," he said from behind her, which was his way of describing it. She turned and kissed him with enough intention that the chairs sat empty for another 20 minutes while they stood in the new warm spring air and were thoroughly grateful for each other. But there were also the things that did not smooth easily into the new life. In May, a man rode into Raven Bluff who Florence did not know but who Grant recognized from across the main street with a change in his body that she noticed instantly, because she had learned to read him the way she read weather, and this was a storm reading. His name, she learned later that evening when he told her, was Earl Goss. Goss had ridden with the old gang and had been one of the ones who scattered when the marshal closed in. He had not been the one who betrayed Grant, but he had known about it beforehand and had said nothing, which was a category of guilt that sat between innocence and culpability in a space that was not comfortable. "He came to town to see if I was worth approaching," Grant said. "He wants a partner for a job in Arizona territory." Florence was very still. "What did you tell him?" "I told him no," Grant said, clearly and without ambiguity. "What did he say to that?" "He said he'd take a few days to let me think about it, as if thinking about it was something I intended to do." Florence looked at him. "Is it?" she asked, not accusingly, genuinely. "No," he said. "I have everything I intend to have, Florence. I'm not going to trade it for anything Earl Goss is offering." She believed him. She believed him completely, which was itself a thing she noted, because a year earlier she would have held a reservation. Now she did not. She believed him the way she believed the morning would come, not because she was naive, but because she had learned the shape of his honesty well enough to stand on it. "Then we need to deal with Earl Goss," she said, "before he becomes a problem that deals with us." "I'm going to talk to Sheriff Warren in the morning," Grant said. "I'm going to tell him Goss is in town and what I know about his prior history and let the law handle it. They'll ask how you know him." "Yes," he said, "and I'll tell them honestly. I've been expecting to have that conversation with the sheriff at some point anyway. Better now than later and on worse terms." She looked at him for a long moment and felt the depth of what she had in him, this man who had come such a specific and difficult distance to be someone he could respect, and who had arrived here and intended to stay arrived. "I'll come with you," she said. "You don't have to." "I'm your wife," she said. "I'll come with you." They went to the sheriff's office the next morning together. Sheriff Warren was a lean, thoughtful man in his late 40s named Daniel Warren, who had been in Raven Bluff for 8 years, and had seen enough of the territory to be a realistic judge of character. Grant told him plainly who he was and who Goss was and what Goss had proposed and what his own history had been. Florence sat in the chair beside her husband and said nothing because it was not her story to tell, but her presence was its own kind of testimony and she understood this. Warren listened without interruption. He asked 3 questions, all specific, all relevant. Then he sat back and looked at Grant for a long time. "I know who Marshall Harker is," Warren said finally. "If what you're telling me checks out with him, and I intend to wire him today, then your status in this county is one of a man who has served his obligation and is living legal." He tapped the desk. "Goss is another matter. If he's here for what you say, I'd like him to leave my town." Goss was escorted out of Raven Bluff by Warren and his deputy the following morning. He went without violence, which was, Warren said, the best possible outcome, and Florence agreed. The wire to Marshall Harker came back within a week, confirming everything Grant had said, and adding a characterization of Grant's service that made Warren look at him with something that might have been the beginning of respect. After this, The weight that Florence had not quite been aware of carrying lifted off her shoulders, and she understood that she had been, at some small and carefully managed level, waiting for the hidden motive to reveal itself, for the dark past to reach a long arm into the present and take something from her. And it had come, and they had met it together, and it had not taken anything. They had stood there in the sheriff's office side by side and told the truth, and the truth had been enough. That evening they sat on the west porch and watched the sun go down over the territory, the sky doing its elaborate slow drama of color that the desert west excelled at, orange and rose, and a thin line of green along the horizon before the stars came in. Grant's hand was over hers on the arm of the chair, and neither of them was talking, and she thought that this was the shape of what she had always wanted without knowing it well enough to ask for it specifically. Summer of 1884 was hot and good. The cattle were healthy. Grant built a proper barn to replace the weathered one that had been limping along since Randall's time, and this one was solid enough that Florence's sister Clara, visiting for 2 weeks in August, walked around it 3 times and said that it was the most reassuring barn she had ever seen. Clara liked Grant. She said so with the directness that ran in the family. "He is nothing like what I expected," Clara said to Florence on the second evening, the two of them sitting on the porch while Grant was in the barn doing something to the latch on the east door. "From your letter I thought he might be more, I don't know, dramatic, more visibly marked by his past." "He is marked by it," Florence said. "He's just not theatrical about it." "That's rare in a man," Clara said. "I know," Florence said. In September, Florence realized she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days, turning it over in her practical hands, examining its dimensions, allowing herself to feel what she felt about it without either rushing toward it or away from it. What she felt was a complex braided thing: wonder, fear, determination, and beneath all of it, a warmth so total it surprised her. She told Grant on the 4th morning at breakfast, because she told him things when she was ready to and not before. He went very still in the way he did when something had moved him past his habitual composure. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "Florence," and stopped, which was unusual for a man who generally had words when he needed them. "I know," she said gently. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before and chose to record carefully. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling all right?" "I feel fine," she said. "Strong. I intend to continue the ranch work as long as it's sensible to do so, and I expect you not to hover." He managed a sound that was part relieved laughter. "I will make every effort not to hover," he said. "I can't guarantee success." "I know," she said again. "I'll allow reasonable concern, with unreasonable concern being renegotiated case by case." "That seems like an equitable arrangement," he said, and brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a tenderness that he did not often display openly, and that therefore meant more for being rare. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of the ranch in ways that Florence managed with her characteristic efficiency, and Grant supported with an attention to detail that became, over the months, its own form of devotion. He took on the heaviest lifting without being asked. He made adjustments to the kitchen so that things she needed were more accessible. He put a chair on the porch that was better for her back. None of these things were announced or presented for credit. They simply appeared, the way the gate latch had appeared, done before she could protest, and done well enough that protesting would have been wasteful. She loved him for this with an intensity that she sometimes sat with quietly in the evenings when he was reading or working at the table, and she was watching him. This man who had learned that kindness is most effective when it is private, whose instinct for doing the useful thing without requiring acknowledgement was so ingrained that she sometimes had to specifically stop and thank him so he understood she noticed. The baby came in the early morning of April 3rd, 1885, with Dr. Patricia Hale, the territory's most capable midwife who had established herself in Raven Bluff the previous year, in attendance. It was a boy. £7 and deeply opinionated from his first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's particular expression of decisive engagement, with everything within his field of view. Grant was allowed in immediately after, which was not standard but which Dr. Hale permitted because she had correctly assessed that the man was not going to do well waiting on the other side of a door any longer than necessary. He came in and looked at Florence first, checking her the way he checked the horizon on uncertain mornings, and only when she said, "I'm absolutely fine, come look at your son," did he come to the bedside and look at the child. He held the baby with the careful, specific attention of a man discovering something he had not known he was waiting for. The infant looked up at him with the unfocused belligerence of the newborn, and Grant said quietly, "Hello, then." "His name is James," Florence said, because she had decided this in the 6th month when she was certain and had not mentioned it because she had wanted it to be a surprise, and she also knew Grant would not argue with her about naming the baby because he trusted her judgment on most things and his judgment on everything it mattered. "James Bailey," Grant said, and the name in his voice sounded like something that had been there waiting. James Bailey grew into a noisy and energetic boy with Florence's quick mind and Grant's patience with physical tasks, and a personality that was entirely his own, fierce and sunny in alternating waves. He was walking by 11 months and talking by 14 and giving opinions by 16 that were too coherent for anyone's comfort. The ranch expanded through 1885 and 1886. Grant's instinct for building and Florence's instinct for the business of cattle proved to be genuinely complementary, and what had been a struggling 30 acres became a properly functioning operation. They bought the adjacent parcel when it came available in the fall of 1886, adding another 20 acres and access to a better stretch of the creek, which improved the cattle's water situation considerably. Florence handled the purchase negotiations herself and came home with a price Grant called remarkable. "You knew he needed to sell more than he needed to hold the price," Grant said when she explained the outcome. "Of course," she said. "I had 3 conversations with him over 2 months before we ever talked numbers. By the time we got to numbers, I knew exactly what he could afford to take." Grant shook his head with a slow admiration. "Florence, what? You are formidable." "I know," she said, and meant it without arrogance. Raven Bluff changed around them through these years, in the ways that territory towns were changing throughout the 1880s. The railroad came to a junction 30 miles east in 1886, which changed the cattle market and the supply network and brought new people and new commerce and new tensions. The question of statehood for New Mexico Territory was an ongoing political argument that Florence followed in the newspapers with the focused interest she brought to anything that affected her land's legal status. Grant became, over time, a respected figure in Raven Bluff in the specific and earned way that is more valuable than the reputation built on birth or money. He was known as a man who kept his word, who worked hard, who helped his neighbors when asked and sometimes when not, who had told the town's sheriff the truth about himself at a moment when dishonesty would have been easier. He served on the town's informal land committee for 2 years, mediating disputes with a fairness that owed something to having been on the wrong side of justice once himself. The past was not erased. It was not a thing that could be erased in a small Western community where information traveled and held. There were people who never entirely forgave it or forgot it. There was one man, a rancher named Aldous Burke, who had lost a freight shipment to the Bailey Gang in 1880, who refused to deal with Grant directly and was cold to Florence at every church gathering for years. Florence bore this with patience and without seeking to resolve it, because she understood that Burke's grudge was legitimate and that the right response was to give it space, not to argue against it. Grant knew this too, and he did not try to make peace with Burke because he understood that some things could not be resolved by asking, and that the most respectful thing was to let Burke keep his judgment. "Does it trouble you?" Florence asked him once at dinner, the question floating up from some long thought she had been having. "Burke," he considered. "Yes and no. It troubles me because I know he's right to hold what he holds. It doesn't trouble me in the sense of wanting it to be different. I can't want it to be different. I did what I did." "But you're different now," she said. "I'm different now," he agreed. "But that doesn't undo what he lost. They're both true at the same time." She looked at him across the table. James was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet. The lamp was throwing warm light across the familiar arrangement of their shared space. "I married a man who is more honest about himself than most people manage to be about other people," she said. He looked at her with an expression that combined gratitude and something that had no good word but was the settled certainty of a man who knows he is exactly where he belongs. "You made me want to be," he said. She shook her head. "No, I didn't make you anything. You were doing this before me." "I was trying," he said. "You made me know why the trying mattered." She got up from the table and went to him, and he shifted his chair so she could sit on the edge of it beside him, and he put his arm around her waist, and she rested her head against his, and they stayed like that in the lamplight while the house settled around them, and the territory night was dark and full of stars outside the window. The second child came in the summer of 1887, another boy, smaller than James had been and quieter from the start, with Florence's green eyes and a disposition that was thoughtful and watchful. They named him Daniel, after Sheriff Warren, who had become one of their genuine friends in the years since the morning they had come to his office and told him the truth. Warren was pleased and embarrassed in equal measure by the honor, and came to the house for supper the week after, and spent the evening talking to James with the earnest patience of a man who had no children of his own, and was genuinely delighted by the proximity of someone else's. James was 2 when Daniel was born and approached his new brother with the suspicious scientific interest of a child examining something potentially competitive. And then, over the course of one afternoon, decided that Daniel was acceptable, and thereafter became his dedicated protector in all situations. The household was full and loud and warm, and Florence moved through it each day with the specific satisfaction of a person whose life is genuinely what they chose, not what happened to them, which is a rarer condition than people pretend. She still ran the cattle. She still negotiated her own prices at the livestock auction and set her own terms, and held her own ground in corral yards full of men who occasionally tried to talk her down. Grant came with her sometimes and stood back and watched with the particular quiet pride of a man who has the good sense to let the person who is better at something be the one who does it. They still argued about territory politics and cattle markets and land management, and occasionally about the specific quality of each other's decision-making on particular points, because they were two people with strong and independent minds and no instinct toward false agreement. "You're wrong about the Northwest pasture," she said one October evening, looking at the sketch map he'd drawn. "I'm considering it," he said. "I haven't decided." "You're wrong while considering it," she said. "The drainage is wrong there for the purpose you're suggesting. Try the eastern slope instead." He looked at the map for a moment. "Show me what you mean." She took the pencil from him and marked it and explained, and he listened with full attention and said, "You're right. Without the particular friction some men produced around that admission." "I usually am," she said, and he laughed, and it was one of the best sounds she knew. In the spring of 1888, a letter arrived from the office of the United States Marshal's Service, directed to Grant Bailey, and Florence watched him open it at the kitchen table with the stillness she recognized as his version of held breath. He read it twice. Then he set it down and looked at her. "It's a formal confirmation of the completion of my service agreement with Harker," he said, "and a notation that as far as the federal jurisdiction is concerned, my record as of the date of the letter is satisfied." He paused. "Harker wrote a personal line at the bottom." "What does it say?" Grant looked back at the letter. "It says, 'Bailey, you're a hard man to bet against. Don't waste it.'" Florence looked at the letter and then at her husband and thought about the specific and unlikely chain of things that had to happen to produce this moment. The broken gate, the dark before dawn, the note left by a man who could easily have ridden past and didn't, the slow and careful months of becoming known to each other, the morning in the sheriff's office, the years of work and truth-telling, and the building of something real out of materials that had not all started clean. "He's right," she said. "You're not a man to bet against." Grant folded the letter carefully and set it aside and reached across the table for her hand, and she gave it to him, and they sat quietly with the two boys making noise somewhere in the back of the house, and the spring morning coming through the kitchen window, and everything they had built together surrounding them completely. That summer, they made two decisions that had been forming for some time. The first was to apply for the official homestead claim on the additional parcel they had been farming for 2 years, which went through in August and added the 20 acres properly to their deed. Florence stood in the land office in Santa Fe because the application required being made in person, and signed her name to the document beside Grant's, and felt the solid satisfaction of a legal right secured. The second was to take in a boy. His name was Matthew Reed. He was 11 years old, and he had been working at the livery stable in Raven Bluff since his mother died of fever in the spring, supervised by the liveryman but essentially fending for himself in the back room. Florence had noticed him in the spring, and had been watching him through the summer with the attention she gave to things that were demanding a decision. He was hardworking and capable and had the look of a child who had learned to be invisible in order to be safe, a look she recognized because she had worn it herself at particular times. She talked to Grant about it in July. He listened the way he always listened, fully and without interrupting, and when she finished he said, "Yes," without qualifications. "You don't need to think about it more." "No," he said. "You've been thinking about it since April. I trust your judgment." She found that she had nothing to add to this. Matthew came to the Bailey Ranch in August of 1888, tentatively, and with the wariness of a child who has learned not to expect permanence. James, who was 3, greeted him with the undiscriminating enthusiasm of a child who simply wanted someone to play with. Daniel, at 14 months, regarded him from the floor with thoughtful green eyes. Florence showed Matthew his room, which had been the small storage room that Grant had spent 2 weeks converting into something proper, with a window that faced the pasture and a shelf for his few belongings and a bed that had a real mattress. Matthew stood in the doorway of it and said nothing for a moment that Florence did not rush. "It's yours," she said, "not on loan, not contingent on anything. Yours." He looked at her with a child's direct assessment of whether an adult can be believed, and she met his eyes honestly and waited. "Thank you, ma'am," he said finally, and went into the room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed his hand flat against the mattress as if checking whether it was real. She left him to settle and went back to the kitchen and stood at the counter and felt something in her chest that was so full it was almost difficult. Grant came in from the barn and looked at her. "All right?" he asked. "More than all right," she said. He came to her and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, and they stood like that in the kitchen, while the sounds of 3 children somewhere in and around the house made the air around them vivid and specific, and entirely worth every hard thing it had taken to arrive here. Matthew settled into the Bailey family with the slow, careful trust of a child who has been taught that trust is a dangerous investment, and is discovering that this particular calculation has come out right. He was good with the cattle in a natural way that Grant recognized and began to teach properly. He was also, it turned out, exceptionally good at the careful work of fence repair, which he performed with an attention to detail that Florence appreciated at the level of a professional recognition. By the fall, he was calling them Grant and Florence rather than Sir and Ma'am, which was the family's preferred arrangement, and by winter he had stopped leaving his boots by the door as if prepared for a rapid departure. The winter of 1888 into 1889 was the hardest the territory had seen in several years. The cold came early and stayed, and there were 2 weeks in January when the temperature dropped so severely that the creek froze in places, and the cattle needed to be supplemented with stored feed every day without exception. Florence and Grant and Matthew worked in rotation so that someone was always available for the cattle, and she found in the grinding necessity of this that the four of them, five if you counted Daniel's useful cheerfulness, had become a family in the way that families become themselves through shared difficulty rather than through ceremony. There was one night in February when a storm moved in from the north with the speed and intention of something personal, and the barn door blew off its hinge in the wind, and they were up at 2 in the morning in the dark and cold trying to keep the cattle inside while the temperature plunged. Matthew held lanterns and James, incredibly awake at 4 years old and utterly convinced he was participating, held onto Grant's coat and was told 3 times to go back inside and refused to, which Florence thought showed a character development she was more proud of than she should probably admit. They got the door refitted as well as it could be in the dark and the cold, braced with the materials they had available, and stood in the barn catching their breath while the storm raged outside. Grant looked at Florence over James's head, where the boy was tucked against his father's side, finally running out of energy, and the look between them was the specific look of 2 people who have been to the edges of their resources together and are still standing. "Good door repair for 2 in the morning," Florence said. "High praise," Grant said. "It was meant to be," she said. They went inside and got warm and put James to bed again, and Florence sat at the kitchen table with her hands around a hot cup and thought about the woman she had been in the winter of 1882, dragging that broken gate through the dirt, alone in a way that had become so total she had almost stopped registering it, and she felt the distance between that woman and this moment as something that moved through her like a slow tide, wide and warm and permanent. The Reverend Coulter came by in the spring, partly for a pastoral visit and partly because he had a practical question about the land committee, and he had coffee at the kitchen table with Florence while Grant was working the fence line. Matthew came in to refill the water bucket. James followed him demanding to know what was for dinner. Daniel crawled purposefully across the kitchen floor in pursuit of a button he had been studying. Coulter looked around the kitchen with an expression that Florence watched with a quiet amusement. "Mrs. Bailey," he said. "Reverend," she said. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for what I said several years ago about your reputation. I was thinking in categories that were smaller than the situation warranted." Florence considered him. He was a man of genuine conscience, even when that conscience moved slowly. "I appreciate you saying that," she said. "I do." "You've built something remarkable here," he said, and he meant the house and the children and all of it. "We built it," she said, "all of us." She stood at the door and watched him ride away and then went to find Grant and told him what the Reverend had said. Grant listened and then said, without particular drama, "It's good when people see what's actually there instead of what they expected to see." "It is," she agreed, "though it takes some of them longer than others." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him briefly, and then straightened up because there was still fence to check. Always fence to check. And they walked the property line together in the warm spring afternoon, while the territory spread around them in all its difficult and beautiful vastness. James Bailey grew up to be the kind of young man who argued about everything, and was usually right, and had his mother's green eyes and his father's patience, and a way of moving through the world that was interested in every detail of it. Daniel Bailey was quieter and deeper and became, in his teens, the family's most skilled horseman, with a way with animals that seemed to be a direct communication rather than a learned skill. Matthew Reed Bailey, because the name came eventually and naturally, and by his own choice when he was 15 and Grant asked him formally, and with the full solemnity the moment deserved, turned out to have an aptitude for building that surpassed even Grant's considerable skill, and he would go on, in his 20s, to design and build structures throughout the territory that were known for their quality and endurance. But those futures were forming slowly in the children's faces, while Florence and Grant Bailey lived their present life with the full attention it deserved. The gate at the end of the road swung on its hinge still. Grant had replaced the hardware twice over the years, keeping it in the same excellent working order he had given it in that first dark before dawn effort. The latch caught solid and sure every time. Florence touched it sometimes in passing, with the specific private acknowledgement she gave to things that had quiet meaning. One evening in the late autumn of 1889, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she and Grant sat on the west porch, and she had the note in her pocket because she had taken it out of the place she kept it, which was in the tin box under the kitchen floor where Randall's $7 had once been, and she was looking at it in the lamplight that spilled through the window. He saw what she had and recognized it. "I thought about that note for days before I came back," he said. "I almost didn't leave it. It seemed forward." She looked at him. "It was the right thing to say. You were alone," he said. "It was true." "I know it was true," she said. "That's why it struck me. Anyone else would have made it into something small, some performance of concern. You said the true thing and left. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the part that made me want to know you." She folded the note back along its original creases and held it in her palm for a moment in the cool, dark air. All that it had started, all that it represented, this specific, unremarkable, life-changing piece of paper. "I'm glad you stopped that morning," she said, "when I was hauling water." "I almost didn't," he admitted. "I told myself it wasn't my place." "What made you stop?" He thought about it with the honesty he brought to everything. "You looked like someone who had been doing the work of two people alone for too long," he said. "And there was that gate, and I had tools and time, and I thought whatever else I am and have been, I can do this one right thing." She looked at him in the lamplight. "You've done considerably more than one right thing." "I've had good company in the effort," he said. She took his hand and they sat together on the porch in the dark, the territory spread wide and cold, and full of stars around their small, warm circle of built light. And she thought about all the things that had to align precisely to produce this moment. A broken gate, a woman who noticed things, a man trying to be better than his past, and the enormous, ordinary, daily miracle of two people choosing each other honestly, and continuing to choose each other through all the particular difficulty of actual living. The stars were very bright over New Mexico that night, as they had been for as long as anyone had been looking, and would be for long after. And Florence Bailey sat on her porch with her husband's hand in hers and felt, with the full clarity of a woman who did not permit herself comfortable illusions, that her life was genuinely and specifically and completely good. The note in her pocket was worn along the creases and slightly faded from years of folding and unfolding. The handwriting was still legible. A woman alone needs a latch. She had never been without the latch since. Not the one on the gate, which was only iron, but the one that mattered more. The one made of honesty and presence and the daily accumulated evidence of being known and chosen by someone who saw you exactly and wanted you anyway. She put the note back in her pocket and leaned her head against Grant's shoulder and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The night settled around them, and the house held its children sleeping, and the land lay quiet under its broad, cold sky. And Florence Whitfield Bailey, who had been a woman alone, was not alone anymore, and had not been alone since the morning she walked to her gate and found it newly latched, and everything that had been broken in her world had begun, quietly and without ceremony, to be made whole.